everybody, this is Unit 6, Lecture 1, Genetics and Environmental Influences. Yes, I'm filming this at school, so hopefully I won't get interrupted by announcements and bells and stuff, but pardon those if they occur. Learning targets. Let's start off with genetic influences. Before we even get into the phases of development, we really need to focus on what makes someone develop the way they do. And that really boils down to this great debate of nature versus nurture. What psychologists have determined is that, and fully admit and acknowledge, is that both nature and nurture impact behavior. And it is actually quite difficult to know which is responsible for which part of you. So do you laugh really loud because that's in your DNA? Or do you laugh really loud because your parents are loud people and your friends are loud people and you just learned to be a loud laugher? This is the sort of thing that nature versus nurture is invested, or that's what the debate is all about. So in nature, if we're talking about the nature of someone, we are talking 100% of the biology of your body. The way your brain developed, the way your DNA developed, your chromosomes, the functionality of your organs and your blood flow, all that stuff. Like, so who your body is, or what your body is made up of biologically and individually. Nurture, on the other hand, is referring specifically to everything else, everything in your environment, the air quality, the way you're loved and how much you're held as a baby, the interactions you have between your siblings and your friends, the interactions you have at school and church and so on. So nurture is pretty much everything in your environment, not like the environment like the leaves on the trees, but your environment like your surroundings, so things that are not built into your body. Evolutionary psychology works on this debate. They are one field of psychology that digs into this debate. And what they've concluded is that, and this is a certain perspective, not everyone agrees with this, but that behavioral similarities arise from biological similarities. So the reason why people act in similar ways is because there's DNA and chromosome and gene factors that cause those behaviors to be similar. In other words, all human motivation, and thereby all the ways that people behave, derives from the desire to spread our gene pool. So we have biological similarities because the fittest, or the qualities in a human that make it survive and be able to reproduce and continue on as a species, is what is determining their behaviors. I put in the phrase survival of the species in here, species. I have trouble with that. Because it will help you recognize when a question might have to do with evolutionary psychology. If we see questions on the human race as a whole, or genes as a whole, we're talking evolution. If we're talking about the biology of a certain individual person, that's biological psychology. So that gets a little bit tricky, but that's the difference. So let me give you an example of evolutionary psychology, of something that they've studied and tried to determine what's a nature factor and what's a nurture factor. So the example I'm giving you is a gender differences example. Evolutionary psychology claims that men tend to be attracted to young women and have more partners throughout life, like significant other partners, because they are seeking out fertility. They're seeking out women of a certain age range, of a certain health, because they can spread their seed, make lots of babies, and then that's a way to guarantee that their genes will continue on along the human race. Women, on the other hand, tend to be attracted to older and more mature men because they need support. They only have the opportunity to make a baby about once a month. And once they do make that baby, they have to keep that baby cooking for nine and a half months or so. And then to keep that baby alive, since they don't have as many chances to make babies, they might need that support from a partner. And so they might be more monogamous or loyal to one partner for the sake of keeping, making sure their pregnancy is successful and then making sure that that child stays alive. Whereas men can make more babies more often, so that might not be as important of a quality. So where am I going with this? Evolutionary psychologists conclude that reproduction differences cause differences in attraction. So we have this nature factor that's affecting our nurture or behavior factors. So nature influencing the way we nurture our relationships with one another, or the behaviors we choose to take on. That is an example of how evolutionary psychology works. Behavior genetics is another field of science and arguably another branch of psychology that kind of crosses biology and psychology. And it studies the relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. That's a mouthful, but really what it's getting at is how much of our behavior is genetically based. Like how much do our genes kind of steer what we do? And at the same time, what's the limit? And where do we have to say, like, well, we can't just keep blaming our genes for us being the way we are. But then they also study the environmental influences on behavior. How much do our surroundings, what's the power of the influence of our parents and our schooling and our social groups, and what's the limit? What are we saying, like, hey, we can't blame our parents for everything? So behavior genetics is studying that overlap of nature and nurture. Okay. And one of the research strategies they use are to study identical twins, separated identical twins, and adopted children. Taking a deeper look into twin studies, just defining identical twins versus fraternal twins. Identical twins come from a single fertilized egg. So one sperm, one egg. We've got fertilization, but then that splits. It is genetically identical, the exact same DNA, the exact same chromosomes, and they even share a placenta, receiving the same nutrients and experience in the womb. Fraternal twins, on the other hand, come from separate eggs. So coincidentally, two eggs are released and happen to combine with two different sperm, obviously from the same mother and father, and so they've got that similarity in their DNA, but because they are a different combination of egg and sperm, it results in two people, of course, so do identical twins, two separate people, but with different DNA where they're genetically similar like ordinary siblings, but they're not exact copies. I would also jot down the scientific names for both of these as well, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce them. Research has shown, in a nutshell, this is really simplifying things, but research has shown that identical twins are much more similar than fraternal twins. So as much as you might be similar to another sibling, brother, or sister that was born at a separate time as you, like there's definitely similarities, but that identical twins are much more similar, including things like abilities, personality, and interests. So we'll get more into this in a moment. Separated twin studies tell psychologists and scientists even more about nature and nurture, because you're taking two people that are almost like little clones of each other in terms of genetics, but then you're raising them in totally different environments, either because they were separated at birth, maybe on accident, maybe because of adoption, maybe because of a family divorce where then they never even saw each other, whatever the reason. This is separated twin studies by taking two people with the exact same DNA and putting them in two different environments, like kind of because that's where life takes them. We couldn't do that as an experiment, can reveal a lot about nature versus nurture. So, a man named Thomas Bouchard developed a study in 1979 called the Minnesota Twins Project, and it was done at the University of Minnesota. And jumping right to the results that he found that identical twins, even separated, growing up in totally different environments, had similarities in their physical attributes. That part's pretty obvious. Personality, abilities, attitudes, interests, and even fears. Okay. And that heredity accounted for 64 to 74% of the differences seen in IQ between the identical twins. IQ is a sticky one because we're going to see evidence that IQ is genetically based, but we're also going to see evidence that IQ is nurture based. The point of separated twin studies is that it allows us to conclude that any differences between two humans, two identical twins, are likely to be environmental. Because they have the same DNA, the things that are the same, we can probably point to and be like, nope, that's their DNA. That's what's causing them to have the same eye color. That's what's causing them to have the same type of laugh or voice. But then the fact that one person might be of a certain religious background, like maybe one's a Christian and then the other one is Jewish, that is an environmental factor, not a genetic factor, because they have identical DNA, and if they're raised in different environments, wouldn't they then, if religion was based on DNA, wouldn't they have the same religion? Okay, so I'm slightly oversimplifying, but that's the benefit of separated twin studies, is it allows us to isolate what is a genetic similarity versus what might be an environmental difference. It's kind of tricky stuff. It's a little complicated, but it's also super interesting. The third type of study that helps behavioral geneticists determine what might be nature and what might be not nurture are adoption studies. So again, we're not going to experiment on humans and take babies away from their families, but sometimes it just happens. And so if psychologists and researchers can track those people down and study them, they can learn a lot. And some of the conclusions that have been drawn from adoption studies are that adoptees' personality traits are more similar to their biological parents, which would indicate that personality is nature-based. So maybe like being shy or outgoing or something like that. But that adoptees' attitudes, values, manners, faith, and politics are more similar to adoptive parents, proving kind of that nurture side of things, which I suppose makes sense. If your personality is kind of who you are, how you're hardwired, like whether you're shy or whether you're outgoing, it then also makes sense that the things you value or learn to believe in come from the ideas that you're taught. A couple side notes here. Adoptees have also tended to be, in studies, more self-giving and altruistic, which perhaps is a reflection of the fact that maybe they feel that sense of gratefulness that another family took them in and loved them and supported them if their biological circumstances didn't allow for that. And not on the screen here, but adoption also enhances IQ scores of mistreated or neglected children. So I said it before, IQ is going to be one of those things that we see in both nature and nurture. There's evidence that IQ is nature-based and part of your DNA, but then there's also evidence like this, that if a child is being mistreated or neglected, but then goes into a supportive and loving and nurturing adoptive family, that their IQ scores actually increase. So then that's kind of a vote for the nurture side of things. And so adoption studies, again, just like the separated twin studies, show us what is culturally or environmentally determined. Okay, so if something is drastically different than biological siblings that they don't live with, or even biological parents that these adoptees don't live with, you can kind of draw some conclusions about what comes from nature and what comes from nurture. Okay, let's move on to environmental influences on development. It's more than just the way you were raised. We cannot blame our parents for everything. This little meme is also kind of funny. Nature or nurture, either way, it's your parents' fault. So even though I just said it's more than the way you're raised or we can't blame our parents, I guess you could argue that if it's from your DNA, you get that from your parents. If it's from the way you're raised, you can blame your parents. But it's meant to be kind of tongue-in-cheek. The environment really involves the experiences you have and the way your brain develops, the influences from your peers and your parents, your social circle, the influences from your culture, and then the influences about gender roles. So let's dive into these. Okay, so experience and brain development. We have found that experiences like playing with toys, going outside, being exposed to different people and different types of conversations help a brain's neural connections develop. I'll show you this video in class, but essentially when rats are put into very enriched environments, lots of toys, ramps, tubes to crawl through, things to other rats to interact with, those rats develop heavier and thicker brain cortexes. And we have also found that infants that are handled more, hugged, snuggled, played with, interacted with, gain weight and develop neurologically faster. So both signs of health and development of the brain. If you go back to some of the other things that we've learned this year, we know that our brain and our neural connections and our memory and our intelligence and all of these things are based on a use it or lose it principle. So the more you use your brain or your brain is activated or stimulated, it's going to help your brain develop stronger and healthier. So much so, my video is covering this up, shoot. But what this is supposed to show is that if there's a rat in a very isolated environment without anything going on, their brain cells only develop like this. And then we'll fix this in class. We'll look at this again in class. Whereas rats that are interacting with each other, are social and have toys and different things to play with, their brain cells become much more advanced and develop many more connections. Okay, the next environmental influence on the way we developed are the influence of peers and parents. And I should really change my heading, but peers and parents. there is a term called selection effect, which basically says that, or acknowledges that kids choose friends similar to themselves. First of all, practically this makes sense, like in a practical sense. Of course, you're going to choose people that like the same things you do or have the same attitudes as you, because that's what's going to make you feel comfortable. That's how you're going to spend time, especially like if you play sports or you enjoy reading the same types of books or eating the same types of food, doing the same things. Of course, those are the people that you're going to connect with. And scientifically or biologically or evolutionarily speaking, it's also evidence that we are social animals, that we choose other people, and that we are predisposed to be very sensitive to our peers' styles and opinions. We are designed to react to other people. And so they're going to have influence on us because we want to connect. We want people to like us. We want to have friends. We need to have peers to play, work, mate, spend time with. Okay? The same could be said about parents in terms of wanting to connect with our parents, but remember, we don't pick our families, at least not in the traditional sense. What research has shown us is that our peers, from our peers, we tend to get our sense of cooperation, popularity, interaction among others our age. All of these things influence who we are from our peers' standpoint. From a parental standpoint, we tend to develop our sense of education and what we think of school and our goals with school, our sense of responsibility, charitableness, our ways of interacting with authority figures and developing future plans. This is more influenced from our parents. Also important to note that the influence of our peers and our parents tend to complement each other. Our parents have an influence, whether you like to admit it or not. They have an influence as to who you spend time with, maybe what neighborhoods you grow up in, maybe what school you go to. So they are able to influence the peers that we develop. Not so sure that our peers influence our parents' influence over us, but I suppose they could influence your attitude towards your parents because you see how they are with their parents. And then finally, culture. Oh, not finally, we got two more. Culture. Oh, this is a lot. I didn't write this down because I feel like it's a given, but if you feel a need to, culture are the behaviors, ideas, and traditions shared by a large group, and it's based on norms. So norms are the ways that the common accepted behaviors in a culture. But when we interact with people that have different norms from different cultures, it can confuse us. So think about societies where personal space is maybe like in America, we take personal space. And this is before social distancing, we take personal space to a greater extent than other cultures where maybe you stand very, very close to each other to talk. Maybe the ways you express your feelings, whether it's just with your face and your hands and your emotions, or even just the way we verbalize. Some societies do that more than others. And the pace of life. Do you live in a culture where you take a siesta at work? Or where you take, where vacations might be weeks and weeks long? Or do you follow kind of the American pace of life, which is go, go, go? Vacations are squeezed in amongst work, and that work is a priority. And what scientists have determined, what researchers and psychologists and scientists have determined is that culture influences specifically the way children are raised. In individualistic societies like Western cultures like the United States and other cultures that are similar, there's an emphasis on thinking for yourself, being independent, setting personal goals, kind of every man for themselves. We can support one another, but really that we're all responsible for ourselves. In collectivist societies, which are often found in Asian and African cultures, the emphasis is more on bringing the family honor, concern for social harmony and making sure everyone's taken care of and is doing well, and that they're more shy with strangers. So are these stereotypes? Yes and no. You can draw stereotypes from these cultures, but there are just some research-based conclusions that have been drawn as well. And last, what is the influence of gender in terms of development? Gender is a little bit unique because there's a nature component and a nurture component. The nature component is that, yes, our gender is genetically determined based on X and Y chromosomes. This signals the production of different hormones that makes your body literally develop. Remember, this is the development unit that makes your body develop in a certain way. But then there's also a nurture component to gender, which is that gender is socially determined. That there are certain gender roles and expectations about what it means to be male and female, and that varies across culture and time. And I guarantee you the way that we view gender roles right now is quite different than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and of course, more. Gender identity is specifically your personal sense of being male and female. And then gender typed is how you get your gender identity. So how are you raised? What is your environment showing you that makes you feel like you are male or female? So gender typed, this is a little bit tricky. I'll go over this in class. But gender typed are like your experiences, I suppose. You could think of them as your experiences or the influences that lead to your gender identity, which then makes you fulfill a gender role. We'll dive into this more in class because this has become more and more complicated as society has advanced. But there is a nature component, but then gender influences our development in a significant way based on nurture, and probably in a more complicated way than ever before. So more depth on this in class, but that is it for this lecture.